She owned nothing. She is nothing. This woman spent 12 years spending my money sleeping in my house and breathing my air, and now she wants half. Nathan Whitmore's voice exploded through courtroom 7 like a thunderclap. He shoved his chair back so violently it crashed against the railing behind him. He stabbed his finger at Emily across the room, his face red, his jaw trembling with pure contempt. You were a housewife, a nobody. You contributed zero to everything I built. Victoria Blake laughed softly from the gallery. The judge raised her gavel, but Emily Carter never flinched. She simply looked down at her folder and turned the page. Nobody in that room knew she was worth $1.2 billion. Before we get into this story, if you are new here, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment telling us what city you are watching from. I would love to see how far this story has traveled. Now let us get into it. The morning of the divorce hearing, Emily Carter woke up at exactly 5:45, the same time she had woken up every single day for the past 11 years. She did not set an alarm. Her body had learned long ago that rest was a luxury she could not always afford, not because of poverty, but because of the kind of mind she carried. A mind that never fully stopped working, turning numbers over like stones in a river, watching patterns shift and change in the dark behind her eyes. She sat up slowly, swung her feet to the floor of her small rented apartment, and stayed still for a moment. She breathed. Outside the window, Los Angeles was just beginning to stir. She could hear distant traffic, the faint sound of a garbage truck somewhere down the block, a bird doing its best against all that noise. She did not think about Nathan. She did not think about the courtroom. She thought about a meeting she had at 2 o'clock the following Tuesday, and whether the restructuring terms she had proposed to her team in Singapore needed one more revision before she signed off. Then she stood up, walked to the small kitchen, made herself a cup of black coffee, and got dressed. She picked a beige coat she had owned for 6 years. She carried a small leather folder, and she walked out the door looking like a woman who had absolutely nothing left. That was, in fact, exactly what she intended. The courthouse on South Grand Avenue had a particular kind of weight to it in the mornings, the way all courthouses do. That mixture of marble and fluorescent light that seems designed specifically to make every human being inside feel smaller than they actually are. Emily walked through the security check, smiled briefly at the officer who recognized her from the last 3 hearings, and made her way down the long hallway to courtroom 7. She arrived early. She always arrived early. She took her seat at the defendant's table, opened her leather folder, and began reading through a set of notes her lawyer Daniel Reynolds had sent her the night before. The notes were thorough. Daniel was always thorough. That was why she had hired him 15 years ago for a different matter entirely, and why she had kept him close ever since. The courtroom filled gradually. Journalists, because Nathan had made sure this divorce got coverage. He wanted the public narrative to be his. A few photographers, curious observers who had heard about the case through the Los Angeles social circuit. Several of Nathan's business associates seated on his side of the gallery, men in expensive watches, who kept glancing at Emily with a specific kind of pity that they did not bother to disguise. Emily noticed all of them. She returned to her notes. Nathan arrived at 8:52. She did not look up when the room shifted the way rooms do when a man who believes he owns every space he enters walks through a door. She heard his voice first, that particular low, confident rumble he had cultivated over years of media training, the voice of a man who had practiced the art of seeming reasonable while being anything but. "Counsel," he said to someone near the door, a greeting, easy, relaxed. Then she heard Victoria. Victoria Blake moved differently than Nathan. Where Nathan was broad and loud and physical, Victoria was precise. Every sound she made was calculated, the click of her heels, the specific pitch of her laugh, the careful way she said words she wanted people to remember. Emily had known women like Victoria her entire life. She had nothing against them personally. She simply understood them very well. "She actually showed up," Victoria said, not quietly, as she passed the defendant's table. "I assumed she would just not bother. I mean, what's the point?" Emily turned a page in her folder. Nathan sat down at the plaintiff's table, loosened his jacket button with practiced ease, and finally looked across the room. Their eyes met. Nathan smiled, that particular smile he used in interviews when a journalist asked him a hard question he had no intention of actually answering. Emily looked back at her notes. The hearing began precisely at 9 o'clock when Judge Patricia Monroe entered and the room came to order. Judge Monroe was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair cut short and reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck. She had been on the bench for 22 years. Emily had done her research. Patricia Monroe did not like games, did not like grandstanding, and had once dismissed a case because one of the attorneys kept addressing the opposing counsel instead of the court. Emily respected her immediately. Nathan's attorney, a sharp man named Gerald Fitch, who billed at $900 an hour and had a reputation for making opposing witnesses feel like children being scolded, stood up first and presented the prenuptial agreement. "Your Honor," Gerald said smoothly, "the terms of this agreement are clear and have been verified by both parties' legal representatives. Mrs. Carter signed this document freely and in full understanding of its contents 12 years ago. In it, she agreed that in the event of divorce, she would receive a settlement of $200,000 and would retain no claim on any assets, properties, or business ventures associated with Whitmore Development Group." He paused. "The plaintiff has also agreed to allow Mrs. Carter to keep her personal vehicle, her personal savings account, which as of the date of this hearing holds approximately $43,000, and her personal belongings." He set the agreement on the edge of the judge's desk with the quiet confidence of a man delivering a conclusion, not a beginning. "We believe this hearing should take no more than 30 minutes. Nathan was watching Emily. How was watching Emily knew for the moment she cracked, for the flash of anger or the glint of tears or the slight trembling of the jaw that would tell him once and for all that he had won. She did not give it to him. She sat perfectly still and wrote a small note in the margin of Daniel's summary sheet, a question about the Singapore meeting, nothing to do with any of this, and waited. From the gallery, one of Nathan's associates leaned toward another and murmured something. The second man nodded, and both of them looked at Emily with that expression, the one that said they had already decided what kind of person she was, what kind of story this was, the powerless woman, the leftover, the one who would walk away with the smallest possible slice of a life she had apparently failed to earn. Emily's paralegal, a young woman named Cora, who had worked for Daniel's firm for 3 years, sat beside Emily and kept her face carefully neutral. But under the table, Cora's hands were pressed flat against her thighs, and Emily could feel the vibration of barely contained anticipation coming off the younger woman like heat. "Steady," Emily said very quietly without looking at her. Cora exhaled slowly. "Sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," Emily said. "Just breathe." Gerald Fitch was still talking. He was explaining in elegant and condescending detail why Emily's lifestyle during the marriage had been funded entirely by Nathan's professional success. He talked about Nathan's early investments, his bold decisions, his vision for the Los Angeles real estate market. He spoke about Nathan the way people speak about monuments, large and permanent and inevitable. At one point he said, and Emily noted the precise phrasing, Mrs. Carter's primary role during this marriage was that of a domestic partner. She was supported fully by Mr. Whitmore's earnings and contributed no measurable professional or financial value to the Whitmore Development Group or its ventures. Victoria Blake in the gallery nodded very slightly. Nathan leaned back in his chair just enough to signal comfort. Judge Monroe wrote something down and did not react. Then Gerald turned to Emily directly, which was a slight violation of courtroom decorum, but he did it with enough confidence that it barely registered and said, "Mrs. Carter, I think we all recognize that this situation is difficult, but the facts are what they are." Emily looked at him pleasantly. "Thank you, Gerald," she said. He blinked slightly, thrown by the first-name familiarity, and sat down. Daniel stood up. Daniel Reynolds was not a showy man. He was 54 years old, built like someone who had played college football and then spent 30 years forgetting about it, and he dressed in suits that were good but never flashy. He had a voice that was easy to underestimate, medium-pitch, unhurried, conversational, right up until the moment it wasn't. He looked at Judge Monroe and said, "Your Honor, we have no objection to the prenuptial agreement." Gerald Fitch looked up from his notes. Nathan's head turned an inch. The murmur in the gallery was immediate, a low ripple of confusion, the sound of people recalibrating their expectations. Victoria's perfectly shaped eyebrow lifted approximately 2 millimeters. "No objection," Judge Monroe repeated, looking at Daniel over her glasses. "None, Your Honor." Daniel was calm, entirely, absolutely calm. The prenuptial agreement is valid and Mrs. Carter accepts its terms. Gerald was already turning toward Nathan, and Emily, watching from the corner of her eye, saw the brief flash of satisfaction cross Nathan's face, the quick private victory, the exhale of a man who had expected a fight and instead received surrender. She watched him enjoy it. She let him have exactly 4 seconds of it. Then Daniel spoke again. "However," he said, and the word landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water, clean, precise, and immediately spreading, "there is one financial matter this court must address before finalizing these divorce proceedings." Judge Monroe folded her hands. "Go on, counselor." Daniel reached into the leather briefcase beside him and withdrew a document. He did not rush. He walked to the judge's desk, set the document down gently, and stepped back. "3 years ago," he said, "Whitmore Development Group faced a significant financial crisis. I believe the plaintiff's counsel is familiar with the situation." He glanced at Gerald. Gerald's expression had not changed, but something behind his eyes had shifted, a tightening, a careful recalculation. "At that time," Daniel continued, "Whitmore Development Group received a rescue investment of $60 million from a private financial institution. This investment prevented the company's collapse, saved approximately 400 jobs, and allowed the plaintiff to maintain his position as CEO and continue building the portfolio he has today." Nathan said loudly enough to be heard, "This has nothing to do with Mr. Whitmore." Judge Monroe's voice was quiet and absolute. "You will have an opportunity to respond." Nathan pressed his lips together. Daniel continued without missing a beat. "The plaintiff has represented both publicly and in previous legal filings that this investment came from an unnamed private equity firm that wished to remain anonymous. He has stated on the record that he had no personal relationship with the investing party." The courtroom was completely still. Daniel looked up from his notes. "Your Honor, the company that made that $60 million rescue investment is called Everstone Capital Partners." He paused. He let the name sit there in the middle of the courtroom. "Everstone Capital Partners," he continued, "is wholly and solely owned by Emily Carter." The silence lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then the gallery exploded. Not loudly, these were lawyers and journalists and social acquaintances people who had been trained to manage their reactions in public. But the sound was there, the sharp intake of breath, the whispered word, the sudden rustling of a dozen people turning to look at Emily all at once. Nathan stood up. "That's insane," he said, and his voice had lost that careful modulation entirely. "That is absolutely insane. Emily does not own, she can't own, you're telling me." "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Monroe said again. "Judge, this is a fabrication. This is clearly a—" "Mr. Whitmore, sit down." He sat down. But his hands were on the table, and Emily could see them, could see the way the fingers had pressed flat and white against the wood, and she thought not unkindly that she recognized this moment. She had watched Nathan lose control of a room before. It was the same whenever a deal fell apart, whenever a contractor delivered bad news, whenever reality arrived somewhere before he was ready for it. He had never learned to absorb a shock gracefully. She supposed that was one of the differences between them. Judge Monroe was reading the document Daniel had placed on her desk. She read carefully the way she did everything, her eyes moving steadily from line to line. The courtroom waited. Victoria Blake had stopped nodding entirely. She sat with her hands in her lap and her face arranged in an expression of careful composure, but Emily could see from 12 feet away, because Emily had spent years learning to read rooms full of people whose faces said one thing and whose bodies said another, that the woman was doing very fast mental arithmetic. Gerald Fitch was leaning close to Nathan and speaking in a rapid, quiet undertone. Nathan was shaking his head. Then Judge Monroe looked up. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, "are you prepared to verify these documents?" "We are, Your Honor. We have verification from 3 independent financial auditing firms, certified corporate filings from the state of Delaware, and a full ownership history of Everstone Capital Partners, dating back to its founding 19 years ago." 19 years, Judge Monroe said. "Yes, Your Honor." A beat. "That would be," the judge said, doing the arithmetic visibly, "approximately 8 years before this marriage began." "That is correct." Judge Monroe set the document down. She looked at Nathan. She looked at Emily. She looked at Nathan again. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "are you aware that your former wife is the sole owner of Everstone Capital Partners?" Nathan's jaw was tight. "I was not aware of that, no." "You were not aware?" "No." The company that saved your business from insolvency 3 years ago. He stopped, restarted. I was told it was a private institution. I was not given the name of the owner. Judge Monroe's expression did not change. Mrs. Carter, she said. Emily looked up. Is this information accurate? Emily said, Yes, Your Honor. You are the owner of Everstone Capital Partners. I am. And your company provided the rescue investment to Whitmore Development Group 3 years ago. We did. At your direction. Yes. Judge Monroe nodded slowly. She picked up a second document from the stack Daniel had prepared, scanned it briefly, and placed it back down. The court, she said, will now enter into the record the verified net worth of Emily Carter as of this fiscal year. She read from the page. $1.2 billion. The sound that went through courtroom 7 was not a gasp exactly. It was something harder to name the collective physical response of a room full of people discovering that the story they came to watch was not the story that was actually happening. It was the sound of an audience realizing they had misread every scene. Nathan said nothing. His face had gone to a color that had no good name, somewhere between white and gray, somewhere between shock and the very early stages of an emotion he would not be able to name until much later. Sitting alone somewhere without the cameras and the associates and the expensive suit. Victoria Blake had stopped doing mental arithmetic. She was very still. 2 of Nathan's associates in the gallery were looking at each other with the specific expression of men who had publicly aligned themselves with the wrong side of a very large story and were now calculating how quickly they could distance themselves. Gerald Fitch was looking at his client. Nathan was looking at Emily. And for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, Nathan Whitmore was looking at his ex-wife, really looking not through her, not past her, not at the version of her he had built in his own mind to make himself comfortable, and he was seeing her. Emily did not look away. She did not smile. She simply held his gaze with the even, steady calm of a woman who had known this moment was coming for a very long time. Mr. Fitch, Judge Monroe said. Gerald stood slightly unsteadily. Your Honor. I would suggest, she said in a tone that made it clear it was not actually a suggestion, that your client take a recess to reconsider his position, given the information this court has just received. Yes, Your Honor, Gerald said. That would be yes. We'll need a recess. 30 minutes, Judge Monroe said. She rose and the bailiff called the room to order, and just like that, just that quickly, the air in courtroom 7 changed entirely. During the recess, Emily stood in the hallway outside the courtroom and accepted a cup of coffee from Cora, who was trying very hard to maintain professional composure and doing approximately 80% of a good job at it. You knew they were going to say all of that, Cora said, about you being a housewife, about contributing nothing. I knew what they would say, Emily agreed. Nathan has been saying it for about 7 years. And you just sat there. Emily sipped her coffee. There was nothing to say, not yet. Cora looked at her for a moment. How long have you been planning today? Emily thought about the question honestly. Longer than today, she said. A door opened at the end of the hallway, and Nathan came through it. He walked toward her with the energy of a man who had spent 30 minutes constructing a version of himself capable of crossing this particular stretch of floor without coming apart at the joints. He had the look, she knew it well, of someone who had replaced genuine emotion with determination, the way you stuff newspaper into a hole in the wall. He stopped in front of her. His voice, when he found it, was lower than usual, quieter, stripped of the public texture. Why? He said. Why didn't you tell me? Emily looked at him. Tell you what, Nathan? About all of it. About Everstone. About everything. I didn't know. I genuinely did not know. I know you didn't, she said. Then why didn't you tell me? She held the coffee cup with both hands and thought about how to answer, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she had given real thought to how to say it when this moment finally came. She had given it more thought than she had given almost anything else in the last 2 years. Because, she said, I needed to know if you loved me. He stared at her. What? I needed to know, she said carefully, if the person you loved was me or if it was the idea of being with someone who had money, or status, or could make you look a certain way. I needed to know what happened when those things went away. Emily. I kept things separate, she said, because it was the only way I could trust what was real. And for a long time I thought I had the answer. For a long time, I thought what we had was real. Nathan's jaw worked. Something moved across his face that she could not entirely read, and she had spent 11 years learning to read that face. "And then," he said, "and then you met Victoria," Emily said simply, "and I got my answer." He said nothing. "You didn't leave me because I had nothing," she said. "You left me because you decided I was nothing, and those are two very different things, Nathan." Back in the courtroom, after the recess, the hearing took a different shape. Gerald Fitch requested time to file amended documentation. Judge Monroe granted it with conditions. Daniel Reynolds, for his part, introduced 3 additional pieces of information into the record, quietly, methodically, the way a skilled surgeon moves through a procedure. No waste, no drama, nothing unnecessary. The first was a timeline of Emily's involvement in specific financial decisions related to Whitmore Development Group during the marriage. Not official involvement. Emily had been careful about that, but documented evidence of the strategic advice she had provided, the market analyses she had shared, the investments she had quietly guided Nathan toward in the early years, when his instincts were strong, but his financial literacy was still catching up. "She advised you on the Burbank acquisition," Daniel said, addressing Nathan directly with Judge Monroe's permission. "Is that correct?" Nathan said after a pause. "She made some suggestions. She modeled the entire financial projection for that deal," Daniel said. "We have the original documents with her handwriting on them. The deal netted your company $18 million. Silence. "The Riverside Residential Project," Daniel continued. "You have stated publicly that the financial strategy behind that development was entirely your own." Nathan said nothing. "Emily Carter developed that strategy," Daniel said. "We have emails, Nathan. We have the actual documents." A journalist in the gallery wrote something, then another. The second piece of information was simpler, a record of the specific moments when Nathan had transferred company assets in anticipation of the divorce. The transfers had been made quietly through a series of intermediary accounts to accounts held in the names of shell corporations that Gerald Fitch had helped establish. Judge Monroe read through the documentation with her reading glasses on and her expression entirely steady. "Counselor," she said to Gerald, "were you aware of these transfers?" Gerald chose his words with great care. "My knowledge of my client's financial management is limited to what I have been. Yes or no, counselor?" A beat. "I had some awareness," he said. The third piece of information was a section of the original investment agreement between Everstone Capital Partners and Whitmore Development Group. It was a standard clause, the kind buried in the middle pages of financial documents, the kind that both parties sign without always reading closely. It gave Everstone Capital Partners the right in the event of certain violations, including the unauthorized transfer of assets during an active legal proceeding, to call the entire loan immediately and assume decision-making authority over specific company operations until the loan was resolved. Nathan had transferred assets, while a divorce hearing was active. While the investment agreement was still in force, the clause had been triggered. "This is not what this hearing is about," Gerald said, and for the first time his voice carried something Emily recognized as actual alarm, not performed outrage, but genuine cold alarm. "Your Honor, these are matters for a separate financial proceeding. The purpose of today's hearing was a divorce settlement. The purpose of this hearing," Judge Monroe said calmly, "is to resolve the divorce between these two parties in a manner that is legally complete and accurate. Information that affects the legal standing of either party is relevant to this court." She looked at the document Daniel had provided. "Mr. Whitmore, were you aware of the terms of the investment agreement between Whitmore Development Group and Everstone Capital Partners?" Nathan was looking at Emily. Emily was looking at Judge Monroe. "Nathan," she heard him say her name very quietly across the room. She did not look at him. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Monroe said, "please answer the question." "I was aware of the terms," Nathan said. His voice was flat, now emptied out. "Yes. And you proceeded with the asset transfers regardless." He said nothing. "I will take that as a yes," Judge Monroe said. She set the document down. She looked at the room, all of it. The gallery, the attorneys, the journalist with the pen who had stopped writing because there was too much to write, and Emily had the impression that Judge Monroe had presided over courtrooms for 22 years and had encountered very few moments quite like this one. "We will recess until Thursday morning," Judge Monroe said, "at which point I expect both counsel to present complete financial disclosure from both parties. All of it. Nothing excluded." She looked at Gerald one more time, and the look was a clear and unambiguous message. "Is that understood, Counselor?" "Yes, Your Honor," Gerald said. Judge Monroe rose, the bailiff called the room, and just like that it was over. For a moment nobody moved. Then slowly the gallery began to stir. The journalists were already on their phones. Two of Nathan's associates were moving toward the exit with the specific urgency of people who needed to make phone calls before certain stories got filed. Victoria Blake stood in the second row, her hands folded in front of her, her face arranged in the careful blankness of someone waiting for the room to empty so she could react privately. Nathan sat at the plaintiff's table and did not move. Gerald leaned down and said something to him, and Nathan shook his head very slightly, and Gerald straightened and began gathering his documents. Emily stood closed her leather folder and nodded to Cora. Daniel was beside her in a moment. "How are you doing?" he asked quietly. "Fine," she said, and she meant it. Not in the way people say it when they don't want to answer the question, but genuinely in the way of someone who has carried a weight for a very long time and has now set it down in exactly the right place. "The asset transfer clause," Daniel said. "He didn't think you'd use it." "He didn't think I knew about it," Emily said. Daniel almost smiled. "He underestimated you." "Most people do," Emily said. And then, because it was the truest answer she could give, "He taught me how to protect myself from it." She picked up her folder, thanked Cora, shook Daniel's hand, and walked toward the exit. She passed Nathan's table. She did not stop. She did not say anything. But she felt his eyes on her back all the way to the door, that strange particular weight of being truly seen by someone for the first time, when it was already too late for it to mean what it once might have. She pushed through the heavy door. She walked into the hallway. She kept walking. Outside, through the glass doors at the end of the corridor, she could see the California sunlight wide and white and entirely indifferent to all the drama that had just rearranged itself inside courtroom 7. She had a meeting tomorrow. She had a company to run. She had a life that had been quietly growing for years and years in the space that Nathan had never thought to look into. She walked toward the light, and behind her in courtroom 7, the story of Nathan Whitmore's certainty, the beautiful, unshakable certainty that he had always been the most important person in any room he entered, began at last to come undone. The Thursday morning hearing came faster than Nathan expected. He had spent the 2 days between sessions doing what he always did when reality refused to cooperate with his version of events. He called people. He called Gerald Fitch 4 times on Tuesday alone. He called his PR consultant, a woman named Diane, who had managed his public image for 6 years, and who now answered his calls with a kind of careful patience that told him she was already preparing for the worst. He called 2 of his board members, both of whom listened politely and said very little. And late Tuesday night, he called Victoria. She answered on the 4th ring. "I need to talk to you," he said. "Nathan." Her voice had a quality he had not heard from her before, measured, distant, the voice of someone creating space between themselves and something they did not want to be associated with. "Victoria, I need you to understand what happened in that courtroom." "I understand what happened," she said. "I was there." "Then you know that Emily hid everything from me. She deliberately concealed—" "Nathan." She stopped him, clean and quiet and final. "I think we should take some time." He stood in his kitchen in his 8,000-square-foot house that he suddenly understood was not entirely his, and he felt the specific cold of a man realizing the scaffolding around his life had been built on assumptions that were no longer holding. "Some time," he repeated. "Yes. Victoria. Good night, Nathan." The line went dead. He stood there for a long moment. Then he set his phone on the counter and looked at the kitchen, the imported marble, the custom cabinetry, the view through the floor-to-ceiling windows that he had always considered evidence of his success, and for the first time in longer than he could clearly trace, Nathan Whitmore felt something he was profoundly unequipped to handle. He felt small. And that feeling terrified him in a way that the courtroom had not, because in the courtroom there had been people to perform for. In his kitchen at 11:30 on a Tuesday night there was no audience. There was only him and the silence and the dawning comprehension that the story he had been telling about himself for 11 years had just developed a very large, very visible crack. By Wednesday morning, the story had broken in 3 separate financial publications. By Wednesday afternoon, it was on the evening news. By Wednesday night, the phrase Emily Carter, billionaire, had appeared in over 400 online articles, and the phrase Whitmore Development Group financial crisis had appeared in nearly as many. Nathan's phone rang continuously. He answered almost none of the calls. Gerald Fitch, he answered. "How bad is it?" Nathan asked. Gerald was quiet for exactly 1 second longer than was comfortable. "It's manageable," he said, "but we need to talk about the asset transfers." "I told you." "Nathan." Gerald's voice was stripped of its courtroom elegance. This was a different voice entirely, the voice the man used when he was not performing and not billing, but simply being honest with a client who needed to hear something difficult. "I need you to tell me everything. Not the version you want to tell, everything." Nathan sat down. He told him. It took 40 minutes, and by the end of it, Gerald was quiet again, longer this time. "The transfers triggered the clause," Gerald said finally. "I know that. She has the right to call the loan. I know that too. Nathan, if she calls it, I know what happens if she calls it Gerald." Another silence. "Did you know it was her?" Gerald asked. "When you made the transfers, did you know that Everstone was Emily's company?" Nathan looked at the ceiling. "No," he said. "I did not know." "But you knew the clause existed." A pause that was its own answer. "Yes," Nathan said. "I knew the clause existed." Gerald exhaled slowly on the other end of the line. "All right," he said. "Then here is what we are going to do." Thursday morning arrived gray and cool, the kind of Los Angeles morning that the city produced in the winter months. Soft light marine layers sitting low over the hills, the air smelling faintly of moisture and distant ocean. Emily was at her desk at 6:15. Not the desk in her rented apartment, the desk in the 43rd floor office of the building on Wilshire Boulevard that served as the headquarters of Everstone Capital Partners. It was a desk she used perhaps 3 days a week because she had learned long ago that the kind of work she did best happened in smaller spaces, in quieter rooms away from the glass and steel that most people associated with power. But today, she wanted the view. She wanted to sit in the chair that faced west with the gray morning spread out below her and the city still half asleep, and feel the specific clarity that came from being exactly where she was supposed to be. Her assistant Marcus, 29 years old, terrifyingly efficient, and the only person on her staff she had told the full truth to 3 months before the divorce proceedings began, brought her a coffee and a briefing summary at 6:30. "The financial press coverage," he said, setting the summary on the desk. "I've pulled the 12 most significant pieces. The tone is it's interesting." "Interesting how?" "Sympathetic," he said. "To you. About 70% of the coverage frames you as the hidden architect. The other 30% is more focused on the Whitmore Group exposure. And the market response, Whitmore Development Group stock is down 9% pre-market." Emily nodded slowly. She had not wanted that exactly. She had not targeted the company's market position that had been a consequence of the asset transfers of Nathan's own decisions of the clause that had existed in the agreement for 3 years without him taking it seriously enough to respect it. But she had known it was a possible outcome. She had made peace with it. "The board called," Marcus said. "Which board?" "Whitmore's board, 4 of the 7 members. They're asking for a conversation." Emily looked at her coffee. "Before or after the hearing?" "They said before if possible." She thought about this. "Tell them after," she said, "and tell them I will make time on Friday morning." Marcus wrote it down. "And Daniel called. He says Gerald Fitch filed a motion last night to delay the proceedings." Emily looked up. "On what grounds?" "Insufficient time to prepare amended financial disclosure." Marcus kept his voice neutral, which was how she knew he had an opinion about it. "Daniel says Judge Monroe will likely deny it." "She will," Emily said. She was right. By 8:45, when the courtroom reconvened, Gerald Fitch's motion had been denied in writing, and Judge Monroe was already seated, her reading glasses on her expression, carrying the particular lack of patience that comes from a judge who has seen a delay tactic from a mile away and is not in the mood. The gallery was fuller than Tuesday, considerably fuller. There were faces Emily did not recognize, financial journalists from publications that had not been there before. 2 people she was fairly certain were board members from competing development firms. And somewhere in the back, a woman with a notebook who Emily had been told was writing a profile for a national magazine. Nathan arrived with Gerald and 2 additional attorneys Emily had not seen before. He was dressed in a different suit, darker, more somber, and he had the look of a man who had prepared carefully for this moment. His jaw was set. His eyes were direct. He had put himself back together in the 44 hours between hearings, and Emily gave him credit for that because she knew it had not been easy. Victoria was not in the gallery. Emily noticed that immediately. She noticed it, filed it, and returned her attention to Daniel, who was speaking quietly beside her. Gerald is going to try to reframe the asset transfers as routine financial management, Daniel said. He'll argue they predated the specific trigger conditions. They didn't, Emily said. No, they didn't. But he's going to argue it anyway, and we need Judge Monroe to have the timeline clearly in front of her before he gets the chance to blur it. You have the timestamps. I have everything, Daniel said. And then quietly, with the satisfaction of a man who had spent 30 years preparing for exactly this kind of moment, everything. Judge Monroe called the hearing to order. Gerald stood first. He had clearly spent the 44 hours reconstructing his entire approach, and Emily watched him do it in real time, the way he adjusted his posture, the way he modulated his voice to signal reasonableness, the careful repositioning of Nathan from aggressive plaintiff to concerned business owner who had simply made some routine financial adjustments during a stressful personal period. Your Honor, Gerald said, the plaintiff acknowledges the discovery of information presented at Tuesday's hearing. He acknowledges that Mrs. Carter's financial history was significant and previously unknown to him. He paused meaningfully. He was, in fact, deceived. The word landed deliberately. Emily felt Daniel's hand very briefly touch her arm. A signal, steady. The plaintiff was deceived, Gerald continued, by a woman who concealed an extraordinary fortune throughout their marriage. A woman who allowed him to believe they were equals in their financial circumstances while secretly controlling an investment empire that directly intersected with his business. He looked at the judge. This is not a simple divorce proceeding, Your Honor. This is a case of deliberate financial concealment, and my client is the victim. Nathan was looking at Emily with an expression she recognized as strategic, not genuine hurt, but performed hurt, the particular arrangement of features that he had used in negotiations for years, the face that said, I am reasonable and wronged and patient, designed to move whoever was watching toward sympathy. She looked at Judge Monroe instead. Judge Monroe was writing something. Mr. Reynolds, she said without looking up. Your response. Daniel stood. Thank you, Your Honor. He did not adjust his posture or modulate his voice. He simply stood the way he always stood, solid, unhurried, occupying exactly the amount of space he needed, and not 1 inch more. Counsel's characterization of Mrs. Carter's conduct as deception is creative, but it is not accurate. Mrs. Carter was under no legal obligation during this marriage to disclose the full extent of her personal financial holdings, particularly holdings she had established prior to the marriage. Her prenuptial agreement made no such demand. Her tax filings, which were filed separately, as is her legal right, were accurate and complete. She broke no law. She violated no agreement. He paused. She simply had a private financial life that her husband never thought to ask about. Gerald was on his feet. Your Honor. Sit down, Mr. Fitch, Judge Monroe said. She looked at Daniel. Continue. The plaintiff's characterization of himself as a victim, Daniel said, requires the court to accept a very specific version of events, namely that Nathan Whitmore, a man who has described himself publicly as a sophisticated businessman with decades of financial experience, was somehow unaware that the woman he lived with for 11 years had independent financial resources. He let that sit for a moment. Your Honor, the plaintiff spent 11 years telling anyone who would listen that his wife contributed nothing to their shared life. He said it in interviews. He said it to his colleagues. He said it in this courtroom 2 days ago, loudly enough that I suspect several people in this gallery still remember the exact words. He looked briefly at the room. We are now being asked to believe that the same man who was so certain of his wife's worthlessness was somehow blindsided by the discovery that she had value. The court may decide for itself whether those two positions are compatible. The journalist in the back row wrote something quickly. Nathan's jaw was tight. But Daniel said, the question of the asset transfers does not actually require us to resolve that debate, because the asset transfers are a matter of documented fact. He walked to the judge's desk and placed a new set of documents down, precisely deliberately, the way he always moved. The plaintiff transferred $14.3 million in company assets across 7 accounts between the dates of September 9th and October 3rd of this year. The divorce proceedings were filed on August 22nd. The investment agreement between Everstone Capital Partners and Whitmore Development Group has been active since the company's rescue 3 years ago. He looked at the judge. The trigger clause is not ambiguous, Your Honor. It is in plain language. It requires no interpretation. The transfers occurred. The clause activated. The consequences are what they are. Judge Monroe looked at the documents. Then she looked at Gerald. Counselor, do you dispute the dates? Gerald stood carefully. Your Honor, the plaintiff maintains that the transfers in question were routine financial management actions that— Do you dispute the dates? Judge Monroe repeated. Her voice had not changed in volume or tone. It was simply more final. A beat. No, Your Honor, Gerald said. We do not dispute the dates. Good. Judge Monroe made a note. Then we are in agreement on the factual record. She set her pen down and looked at both tables. I want to be very clear about what this court is and is not deciding today, she said. The divorce settlement per the prenuptial agreement that both parties have agreed is valid will proceed as written. Mrs. Carter will receive the settlement outlined in that agreement. She looked at Emily. However, she looked at Nathan. The financial consequences of the triggered investment clause are a separate matter, and they are real, and they are not within this court's power to set aside. That is a matter between Everstone Capital Partners and Whitmore Development Group, governed by the terms of their existing agreement. This court cannot and will not interfere with those consequences. Nathan said, Your Honor, Mr. Whitmore. Judge Monroe looked at him directly. You signed that agreement. Your legal team reviewed it. The clause is in it. This court did not put it there, and this court cannot remove it. She paused. Is that understood? Nathan looked at his hands. Yes, Your Honor, he said. It was the quietest she had ever heard him. Outside, during a brief recess, the hallway was different than it had been 2 days before. The energy had shifted the way weather shifts before a storm, not by getting louder but by getting heavier, more serious, more honest about what it actually was. 2 of the financial journalists were on their phones. One of Nathan's new attorneys was having a rapid, unhappy conversation with Gerald near the water fountain. 3 people Emily did not know were looking at her openly now, not with pity this time, but with the specific attention that powerful people give to other powerful people when they have just recalibrated their understanding of the room. She stood near the window at the end of the hall and checked her phone. There was a message from her head of operations in London, a routine update about a portfolio company's quarterly numbers. She responded to it. Precise, brief, complete. Daniel appeared beside her. He wants to talk to you, Daniel said. She did not look up from her phone. Nathan. Gerald, actually, on Nathan's behalf. She finished her response to London and put her phone away. About what? About the clause. About whether you intend to call the loan. She looked at Daniel. What did you tell him? I told him that was Mrs. Carter's decision, and that she would let them know in due course. Daniel paused. They're scared, Emily. Gerald knows what calling that loan means for the company. She knew what it meant. She had known for 3 years. She had structured the agreement the way she structured all of her agreements carefully, thoroughly, with full awareness of every possible outcome. Calling the loan would give Everstone operational authority over key Whitmore assets. It would effectively put her in control of a significant portion of the company that Nathan had built. Had partly built, she corrected herself more honestly than she usually allowed herself to be, because the truth was that some of what Nathan had done was genuinely his, genuinely the product of his ambition and his instinct and his willingness to take risks that she herself would have structured more conservatively. That truth was not a comfortable one. But Emily Carter had spent her life being honest with herself because she had found long ago that self-deception was the most expensive habit a person could develop. Tell Gerald, she said, that I will have an answer for them by Monday morning. Daniel nodded. And Daniel, she looked at him. Tell him the answer depends on what Nathan does between now and then. Daniel understood. He always understood. It was the quality she valued most in him, not his legal brilliance, though that was real, but his ability to grasp the space between what was said and what was meant, and to carry it accurately from one room to another. He went to find Gerald. Emily stood at the window. Below, the city was fully awake now, traffic moving in all directions, people on the sidewalks, the ordinary continuous motion of a place that did not stop for anyone's private catastrophe. She had always found that comforting in a strange way. The city's indifference was not cruel. It was simply honest. Life went on. The question was always what shape you were in when it did. She thought about the first time she had seen Nathan across a room 23 years ago at a real estate conference in San Francisco, where she had gone not because she was interested in real estate, but because one of her early investment targets was presenting, and she liked to see the people behind the numbers before she committed capital. Nathan had been there because he was trying to get someone to fund a small development project in the East Bay, and he had the specific energy of a man who believed entirely in himself and was still waiting for the world to catch up. She had found it magnetic then. She had found it exhausting eventually. And now she found it. She searched for the right word, clarifying. Because the person Nathan had shown himself to be in this divorce, in these hearings, in the years of slow and steady diminishment that had preceded them, was also a real person. It was not a mask or a performance. It was Nathan. The same ambition that had made him magnetic at 23 had calcified over years of unchecked success into something harder and less flexible, something that could not bend without breaking. She did not hate him for it. She had stopped hating him somewhere around the 6-month mark after he asked for the divorce, when she had done what she always did, with painful things. She had sat with it long enough to understand it, and understanding it had drained the heat out of her anger, and what remained was something cooler and more workable. Not forgiveness exactly, something more useful than forgiveness. Clarity. Back in the courtroom, the afternoon session moved with the precise efficiency of a proceeding that had reached its logical conclusions and was now managing its own aftermath. The prenuptial settlement was formally entered. The financial disclosure documents were submitted. Judge Monroe set a follow-up date for 3 weeks out to review the amended filings. And then near the end of the session, Nathan did something that Emily had not expected. He asked to address the court directly. Gerald looked as though he would have preferred that Nathan not do this, but Nathan had already stood and Judge Monroe had already nodded permission, and Gerald sat back with the expression of an attorney who had decided to treat this as a situation beyond his control and manage his face accordingly. Nathan stood. How was not performing now? She could see it immediately, the absence of the particular physical arrangement that he put on when he was in public mode, the slight squaring of the shoulders and leveling of the chin that he used, the way other people use business cards. He was just standing, slightly uneven, slightly unsure where to put his hands slightly, and this surprised her more than anything else that had happened in 2 days of surprises human. "I want to say something for the record," he said. His voice was low and direct. "I'm not saying this for legal reasons. Gerald has already told me it doesn't help my case. I'm saying it because—" He stopped, started again. "Because I think it needs to be said." Judge Monroe watched him. "I did not know," he said, "about Everstone. I did not know it was Emily's company. I did not know what she had built." He paused. "But I should have asked. I should have asked a long time ago, and I didn't ask because I had already decided I knew the answer. I had decided what kind of person Emily was, and I stopped looking." Another pause. "That was my failure, not hers." The courtroom was very quiet. "I said things in this room 2 days ago," he said, He looked at Emily, "that were not fair, and I said things like that for years before we ever got to this room, and I'm saying now on the record that I was wrong." He sat down. Gerald stared at the table in front of him. Emily looked at Nathan for a moment. Just a moment. Long enough to register that what she had just witnessed was real. Not a tactic, not a legal maneuver, not the strategic performance of a man trying to soften a judge. Just a person saying a true thing in a room full of witnesses, which was one of the harder things a person could do. She looked back at Judge Monroe. Judge Monroe was writing something and did not look up, but Emily had the distinct impression that the woman had absorbed every word of what Nathan had just said, would retain it, and would give it exactly the weight it deserved, no more, no less. That evening, Emily returned to her office on the 43rd floor. She did not go home. She sat at her desk with the city spread out to the west, now going golden in the late afternoon, and she pulled up the Everstone internal files on her laptop and looked at the Whitmore account. 14 years of documents. The original investment analysis she had done on Nathan's company in the early years of their marriage, when she had seen clearly, precisely, with the same analytical clarity she applied to all of her targets, that the company had exceptional bones, but was being managed with more courage than discipline. The quiet guidance she had provided through channels he never connected to her. The rescue investment 3 years ago, when the company's expansion into the Nevada market had gone sideways, and Nathan had been 2 quarters from catastrophic failure, and she had made the decision alone without telling him, without asking for credit or gratitude, to extend the capital that kept it alive. She had done it because she still loved him then. She had done it because the company employed 400 people who had nothing to do with her marriage. She had done it because she was at her core, someone who protected things that mattered, even when the people inside them had stopped treating her like she mattered. She opened a new document. She began to write. It was not a legal filing, not a financial memo, not the kind of document she typically produced at her desk on the 43rd floor. It was something she had been composing in her head for 2 years, through all the slow, painful months of the marriage's collapse, and the decision to file, and the hearings, and the revelation, and Nathan's public cruelty and his private apology. It was a letter to no one, or to herself, or to the woman she had been at 23, sitting in a conference room in San Francisco, watching a young man with spectacular self-belief try to convince a room full of skeptical investors that he was going to be someone. She had believed him. She had been right. She had just also been right about herself at the same time, which was the part of the story that nobody had thought to ask about. She wrote for 40 minutes. Then she closed the document without saving it, closed her laptop, and stood up. Marcus appeared in the doorway. "The Whitmore board members have confirmed Friday morning," he said. "All 7. "Good," she said. "And there's something else." He hesitated, which was not something Marcus typically did. "Someone from the board reached out separately. Off the record." Emily looked at him. He said, Marcus checked his notepad. He said, and I'm quoting directly, "Tell her we've been waiting for someone to actually run this company for a very long time." Emily was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Which board member?" Marcus told her. She nodded slowly. She knew him, had known of him for years, had tracked his career from a distance, had noted the specific intelligence of his public statements, in contrast to the general noise of the Whitmore board's public communications. He was one of the people she had hoped would still be there when this moment came. "Tell him I look forward to Friday," she said. She picked up her bag, said goodnight to Marcus, and walked to the elevator. The doors opened. She stepped in. And as the elevator descended 43 floors, the city dropping away floor by floor outside the glass, the lights coming on across Los Angeles, as the sky went dark, Emily Carter felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a very long time. Not triumph. Triumph was for people who needed the audience. Not relief. Relief implied she had been afraid, and fear had left her somewhere around the moment she made her decision 2 years ago, in a quiet office with a phone call she had made alone. What she felt was something simpler and more durable than either of those things. She felt ready. The elevator hit the lobby. The doors opened. She walked out into the Los Angeles evening, and the city was loud and bright and completely indifferent, and she was exactly where she had always been, exactly where she had built herself to be. And on Friday morning, she was going to walk into a room full of people who had spent years looking through her, and she was going to change every single thing about what happened next. Friday morning arrived the way consequential mornings always do, quietly, without ceremony, as if the day had no idea what it was about to contain. Emily was already in the building at 7:15. She had slept 6 hours, which was more than she had slept the night before the first hearing, and less than she needed, but enough. She had learned long ago that the body could carry more than it thought it could provide. You gave it something worth carrying toward. Marcus had arranged the conference room on the 42nd floor, the large one with the long table and the west-facing windows, and the chairs that were comfortable enough to signal respect, but not so comfortable that anyone forgot this was a working meeting. He had placed water and coffee at each seat, a printed agenda at every place, and a single manila folder face down at the head of the table where Emily would sit. He had also, without being asked, placed a single yellow legal pad and a pen at Nathan's seat. Emily noticed this when she walked through to check the room. "Why the legal pad?" she asked. Marcus said, "Because in my experience, people who are used to being in charge feel better when they have something to write on, even if they never use it." She looked at him. "That's very perceptive." "I've been watching you run meetings for 3 years," he said simply. "I've learned a few things." She almost smiled. "Where is he?" "Lobby. His attorney is with him. Gerald is not." She had expected that. Gerald had called Daniel Thursday evening to confirm in careful legal language that Nathan would be attending the Friday meeting without formal legal representation, in the interest of Gerald's phrase, a more productive dialogue. Daniel had relayed this to Emily with the tone of a man who was not entirely sure what to make of it. Emily had been very sure what to make of it. Nathan was coming without Gerald, because Gerald had told him almost certainly that the legal battle was no longer the primary terrain. The legal battle had already produced its outcome. What happened now was not a courtroom matter. It was a business matter. And Nathan, whatever his failures in the personal sphere, understood business. That was, Emily reflected, the one thing they had genuinely shared. At 7:58, the Whitmore board members began to arrive. They came in a cluster, 4 of them together, which told her they had coordinated, which told her they had been talking to each other before this meeting, which told her something important about where the internal politics of the board already stood. The other 3 arrived separately within the following 6 minutes, which told her something equally important about where those 3 stood. She greeted each of them by name. She had studied all 7 before they arrived, their backgrounds, their tenures, their public statements, their known relationships with Nathan, their financial interests in the company. This was not calculation exactly. It was the same thorough attention she gave to every significant interaction in her professional life. She had learned at 26 that people felt it when you knew who they were, and that feeling built a foundation faster than anything else she had ever tried. The board member who had sent the message through Marcus, a man named Robert Ellison, 61 years old, former CFO of 2 major development firms with 22 years of experience in reading corporate structures, was the last of the first cluster to shake her hand. He held it a beat longer than the others. "Mrs. Carter," he said. His voice was steady and dry and carried the specific quality of a man who had spent decades saying more with less. "It's good to finally meet you properly." "And you," she said. "I've read your work, the 2019 restructuring analysis you published in Urban Land. It was very good." He looked at her with an expression she recognized as genuine surprise, the kind that comes when someone expects to be underestimated and finds they are not. "You read that," he said. "3 times, she said. "Please sit down." Nathan arrived at 8:03. He came in without fanfare, which she had also not entirely expected. In the old world, the world of 3 weeks ago, before Courtroom 7 rearranged everyone's understanding of the room. Nathan Whitmore entering a board meeting had been an event. He had understood how to make an entrance, how to use physical presence and controlled timing to signal authority before anyone spoke a word. Today he came in like a man who was not sure what kind of room he was walking into, which Emily thought was actually the most honest he had been in a very long time. He saw her at the head of the table. He stopped for just a fraction of a second, not enough for anyone else to notice, but she noticed, and then he walked to his seat, which Marcus had placed not at the opposite end of the table as Nathan might have expected, but 2 seats to Emily's left among the board members. Equal, present, not opposed. He looked at the legal pad. He sat down. "Thank you all for coming," Emily said. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The room was already hers, not because she had taken it, but because she had built toward it for years. And rooms have a way of recognizing when the right person is finally in the right chair. "I want to start by being direct about why we're here, because I think you've all had enough of the indirect version of this story." She opened the manila folder in front of her. "Whitmore Development Group is a good company," she said. "It has good assets, a solid market position, and 412 employees who come to work every day and do their jobs well. None of what has happened in the last 2 weeks is their fault, and none of what happens next should cost them anything." She paused. "That is my primary concern. Not the loan, not the legal proceedings, not any of the personal history in this room. The people who depend on this company for their livelihoods. That is where I am starting." Robert Ellison was watching her with the focused attention of a man recalibrating everything he thought he knew. Nathan was looking at the legal pad. One of the other board members, a younger man named Carson, early 40s, who had been openly affiliated with Nathan's faction of the board in the company's public filings, said, "Mrs. Carter, with respect, the clause gives you significant authority, but the board retains Mr. Carson," Emily said, not sharply, not dismissively, simply with the kind of clarity that stops a sentence cold without requiring volume. "I know exactly what the board retains. I've read the company's governance documents more carefully than most people in this room, I suspect. I am not here to override the board. I am here to work with the board." She looked at him steadily. "Those are very different things. I need you to understand that before we go any further." Carson looked at his folder. Good, Emily said. Then let's talk about the actual situation. What followed was 2 hours of the most concentrated professional conversation Emily had conducted in recent memory, and she had conducted some very concentrated professional conversations. She walked the board through the full financial picture of the company, not the version Nathan had been presenting to them in quarterly reports, which was accurate but selectively framed, but the complete version including the areas of exposure that Nathan had been managing quietly and that the board had, she suspected, only partially understood. She was not accusatory about it. She presented the information the way she presented all information as facts, laid flat without editorial, allowing people to draw their own conclusions. She had found that this approach produced better outcomes than dramatic revelations because it respected people's intelligence and gave them room to respond rather than react. But the facts laid flat were still substantial. 37 minutes in, one of the board members, a woman named Patricia Huang, 56, who had the specific patience of someone who had been waiting a long time to say something, put her pen down and said, "How long have you known about the Nevada exposure?" The room went very quiet. Emily said, "Which specific aspect of the Nevada exposure?" "The subcontractor liability," Patricia said. "A beat." 2 years, Emily said. Patricia nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she had suspected. Nathan looked up from the legal pad. His jaw was tight. "I managed the Nevada situation." "Nathan," Emily said. Her voice was not unkind. It was simply final. "Let me finish." He stopped. She continued, "The subcontractor liability in Nevada, a contractual tangle involving 2 firms and a disputed completion bond, had been sitting in the company's undisclosed risk register for 22 months. It was not catastrophic. It was manageable. But it was exactly the kind of thing that became catastrophic if left unattended for another 2 quarters. And Emily had been watching it with the specific attention of someone who understood what it would cost if it blew. She had a proposed resolution. She presented it in 12 minutes, clean, precise, costed, with a timeline and 3 contingency scenarios, depending on how the counterparties responded. When she finished, Robert Ellison looked at the summary she had placed in front of him and said quietly, "You've been working on this." "For 8 months," she said. He looked at her. "Why didn't you—" He stopped, reconsidered the question in light of everything that had happened. "Never mind," he said. "I understand why." Nathan said nothing. The second twist of the morning came 51 minutes into the meeting, and it came from a direction nobody in the room had anticipated. Carson, the board member who had pushed back at the beginning, the one who had been most visibly aligned with Nathan's position, slid a piece of paper across the table toward Emily. "I want to put something on the record," he said. His voice had changed from earlier. The defensive edge was gone, replaced by something more considered. "Before this meeting, I was prepared to argue against any expanded role for Everstone in the company's operations. I want to be transparent about that." He nodded at the paper. "That's a summary of the concerns I brought in here this morning. I'm putting it face up on the table so everyone can see I had a position, and I'm telling you what it was." Emily looked at the paper. She did not pick it up. "Thank you," she said. "What changed?" Carson paused. "You knew about the Nevada subcontractor issue," he said. "I've been on this board for 4 years. Nathan briefed us on Nevada twice. Neither briefing mentioned the liability." He looked at Nathan directly, not with anger, but with the careful, slightly sad expression of a man revising a relationship. "You knew about it before either of those briefings," he said to Nathan, "didn't you?" It was not a question. Nathan looked at the table, then he looked up, and the thing that Emily had been watching for across 2 hearings and 1 meeting and 44 hours of a man trying to rebuild himself into something he could live with, the thing finally arrived. "Yes," Nathan said. "I knew." The word sat in the middle of the table like something heavy and permanent. "I managed it," he said. "I always managed it. I didn't want the board second-guessing every call I made, so I—" He stopped. "I kept things close." Patricia Huang said very quietly, "That's not your decision to make, Nathan." "I know that," he said. "I know." The room absorbed this for a moment. Then Emily said, "The question in front of us is not what happened. The question is what happens next." She looked around the table, all 7 board members, and Nathan, and the weight of a company, and 412 people, and a very specific moment in time. "I have a proposal. I want to present it, and then I want to hear from every person in this room. Not a vote, a conversation. And then we decide together." Robert Ellison said, "Go ahead." She laid it out. Everstone would not call the loan. She said this first directly without preamble, because she wanted it off the table before anything else was discussed. The loan would remain active under its existing terms, with one amendment. The reporting requirements would be expanded, and Everstone would have a seat on the board's finance committee in an advisory capacity. Not a decision-making role, an advisory role. She watched Nathan's face as she said this. How was listening? Really listening, not managing the room, not calculating the next move, but sitting with the information and letting it land. It was, she thought, one of the most significant behavioral changes she had seen from him in 11 years. The second element of her proposal was a leadership transition plan. Not Nathan's immediate removal, she was explicit about this. Nathan had built real things. He knew this company, knew its contractors and its market and its people in a way that took years to develop and could not simply be transplanted. But the concentration of authority that had allowed him to manage things like Nevada quietly without board oversight had to change. She proposed a restructured executive team with clear accountability lines and a new COO position that would report jointly to Nathan and the board. "You'd still be CEO," she said to Nathan directly, "but the structure around you changes. You'd have support and accountability both, which," she paused, "in my honest assessment would have helped you avoid some of the decisions you made that got us all into this room." Nathan was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Who's the COO?" It was Emily recognized exactly the right question for exactly this moment. Not a rejection, not a capitulation, but the question of a man who was trying to understand the new shape of something and figure out where he fit inside it. "Someone the board selects," Emily said, "through a proper process, with input from you." She looked at him. "This is not a takeover, Nathan. I'm not interested in running a development company. I have a company." She held his gaze. "What I am interested in is making sure that the company you built doesn't collapse because of decisions made in the last 3 years. Not for your sake, for the 412 people who have nothing to do with any of this." Something moved across Nathan's face. Robert Ellison said, "I'd like to call a brief recess." Emily said, "Of course." The board members stepped out. Nathan remained in his seat, and for a moment it was just the two of them in the conference room on the 42nd floor, with the city spread out beyond the glass, and the sound of Marcus moving quietly in the outer office, and the particular specific silence of two people who had shared 11 years of a life and were now sitting on opposite sides of something that had irrevocably changed. Nathan said, "You could have destroyed me." Emily said, "Yes." "The clause, calling the loan, the board, the press already has enough to—" He shook his head. "You had everything you needed to take the whole thing apart." "I know." He looked at her. "Why didn't you—" She thought about the answer she had prepared, the clean professional answer about the employees, about the company's fundamentals, about the long-term value of stability over disruption. It was all true. She believed it completely. But sitting across from Nathan, in the particular quiet of that room, she found herself giving him a different answer, the truer one. "Because destroying things is easy," she said, "and I've never been interested in easy." He looked at his hands. "I said things to you," he said, "in that courtroom. Years before that courtroom I said things." He looked up. "There's no version of an apology that— Nathan." She stopped him, not unkindly. "I know." He nodded. "For what it's worth," he said, "I meant what I said on the record, in front of the judge. I meant it." "I know that too," she said. The board members returned 11 minutes later. Robert Ellison sat down and looked at Emily with the focused directness she had come to associate with him in the hour and 40 minutes she had known him. "We have some questions about the finance committee structure," he said. "Ask them," Emily said. What followed was another 40 minutes of the kind of conversation that Emily had spent her career working towards: specific, honest, productive. The kind of dialogue that happened when people stopped performing and started actually trying to solve something together. Carson asked 3 sharp questions about reporting timelines and got 3 complete answers. Patricia Huang raised the Nevada resolution plan and suggested a modification to the second contingency scenario that was, Emily recognized immediately, genuinely better than her original version. She said so. Patricia looked briefly surprised, then she smiled very slightly. By the time the meeting concluded at 10:47, the following had been agreed: Everstone would maintain the loan under amended terms. An advisory seat on the Finance Committee would be formalized within 30 days. A COO search would begin immediately with a joint selection committee, including 2 board members, Nathan and 1 representative designated by Emily. The Nevada liability would be addressed using the resolution framework Emily had presented with Patricia's modification incorporated. Nathan signed the preliminary agreement document that Daniel had prepared and that Marcus had quietly placed on the table at some point during the board recess without anyone quite noticing when. As the board members gathered their things and began moving toward the door, Robert Ellison paused beside Emily's chair. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said low enough that it did not carry. "You can ask," she said. "How long did you know the company was in trouble, the real trouble, before the rescue investment?" Emily thought about this honestly. "I identified the exposure about 6 months before I made the investment," she said. "I spent those 6 months deciding whether to move." "What made you move?" She looked at him. "I walked through one of the Nevada job sites," she said. There was a crew of about 30 people. They'd been working that site for 18 months. They had families. They had mortgages. They had no idea that the company financing their paychecks was 8 months from insolvency. She paused. "I moved because of them." Ellison was quiet for a moment. "Not because of Nathan." "Nathan was part of the calculation," she said honestly. "But he was not the deciding factor." Ellison nodded slowly. He looked toward the door where Nathan was standing and speaking quietly with 2 of the other board members, his shoulders less rigid than they had been 2 hours ago, his hands finally still. "He built some good things," Ellison said. "It was not a defense, just an honest assessment." "He did," Emily agreed. "He also made choices that almost destroyed them. Both of those things are true." Ellison looked at her. "And you can work with both of those things." "I've been working with both of those things for 11 years, she said. "I think I can manage another restructuring cycle." He almost laughed. It was the closest thing to warmth she had seen from him, and it landed well. He shook her hand again this time with both of his. "Friday," he said as he moved toward the door, "was a very good meeting." When the room was empty, Marcus appeared in the doorway. He was holding a phone and had the look of someone who had been managing a queue of incoming communications for the past 3 hours with considerable efficiency. "The press are calling," he said. 4 outlets. They want a statement." "Tell them we'll have something Monday," Emily said. And Daniel called. He says the court accepted the amended filings. The divorce is finalized as of this morning. She absorbed this. It was strange. She thought how a thing could be both enormous and quiet at the same time, the end of a marriage reduced to a procedural notation in a court record. The end of 11 years confirmed in a phone message delivered by an efficient 29-year-old while she was reorganizing the governance structure of her ex-husband's company. "Thank you, Marcus," she said. "There's one more thing." He hesitated again, and she was beginning to learn that when Marcus hesitated, it was always worth waiting for. "The woman from the magazine, the one who was at the second hearing. I remember her. She sent a request, not for a quote, for a conversation." Marcus looked at his notes. She said, "He checked his phone. She said she's not interested in the divorce story. She's interested in Everstone, in how you built it. She said, and I'm quoting, 'I want to write about a woman who built a billion-dollar company in complete silence, and I want to understand why she chose silence.'" Emily was still for a moment. She thought about this question. It was a good question. It was in fact a question she had been asked before by herself in the quiet hours before sleep in the space between decisions. Why silence? Why not the magazine covers the conference keynotes the public profile that her financial position could have generated 100 times over if she had wanted it? The answer was the same as it had always been. She had not chosen silence because she was afraid of visibility. She had chosen it because the work was the thing and the work did not require an audience. She had built Everstone the way she built everything, by understanding the fundamentals, by making decisions grounded in reality rather than ego, by caring more about getting it right than about being seen getting it right. And perhaps she admitted to herself now, sitting in the empty conference room with the city below her, and a finalized divorce in the court record, and a board agreement on the table, and a company that was no longer in danger of collapsing. Perhaps some of the silence had also been about protection, not of herself, of the work, of the thing she was building. From the specific kind of damage that came when someone who did not understand what you were doing decided they had the authority to interfere with it. She had protected it. And now it was solid enough that it did not need protection anymore. "Tell her yes," Emily said. Marcus looked up. "Yes to the conversation." "Yes to the conversation," Emily said. "Tell her I'm available Tuesday, and tell her to come prepared because I don't repeat myself." Marcus wrote it down. The corner of his mouth moved approximately 2 millimeters in what Emily had come to recognize as his version of a smile. He left. She sat alone in the conference room for another moment. The board agreement was in front of her. The manila folder was closed. The legal pad that Marcus had placed at Nathan's seat was still on the table, and she could see now that the room was empty, that Nathan had written something on it after all. Not much. A few words near the top of the first page. She did not read it. She stood up, gathered her folder, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she paused. She went back. She picked up the legal pad. Nathan had written 4 words in the same slightly cramped handwriting she had known for 11 years. "You were always right." She set the pad back down. She stood there for a moment with her hand still on it. Then she took her hand away, picked up her folder, and walked out of the conference room and into the hallway and toward the elevator that would take her back to the 43rd floor where her desk was and her laptop was and her work was and her life was her real life, the one she had built with intention and care and complete perfect silence for 19 years, while everyone else in every room she entered had looked right through her and seen nothing worth looking at. The elevator opened. She stepped in. The doors closed. And Emily Carter rode upward away from the boardroom and the legal pads and the careful words of men who were only now beginning to understand what kind of person had been standing among them all along. She had a company to run. She had always had a company to run. The only difference now was that everyone finally knew it. The Tuesday interview arrived faster than Emily expected, which was unusual because Emily Carter was not a woman who was typically caught off guard by the passage of time. Her name was Claire Donovan, 41-years-old senior writer for a national business publication that Emily had read for years without ever imagining she would appear in it. Claire arrived at the Everstone offices at 9 in the morning, carrying a canvas bag, a voice recorder, and the particular energy of a journalist who had done her homework so thoroughly that she was no longer nervous about the conversation. She was hungry for it. Marcus brought them both coffee and closed the door. Claire set the recorder on the table between them, looked at Emily and said, "Can I start with something that isn't in any of the filings?" Emily said, "That depends on what it is." "When did you first know the marriage was over? Not the legal decision, the internal decision, the moment you knew." Emily looked at her for a moment. It was a good opening. It was the kind of question that only worked if the person asking it had already established that they were not going to flinch from the answer. 3 years ago, Emily said, before the rescue investment. Claire's pen moved. "Before you saved his company." "Yes. You knew the marriage was over, and then you put $60 million into his business." "Yes." Claire looked up. "Why?" Emily had answered this question for herself many times. She had answered it in the dark at 2 in the morning and in the middle of meetings when her mind drifted and in the quiet of the elevator on the 43rd floor. But she had not answered it out loud to another person until this moment. Because the marriage being over, she said carefully, had nothing to do with whether the company deserved to survive. Those were 2 separate questions, and I have always been very deliberate about not letting personal pain contaminate professional judgment. She paused. Also, and this is the part that is harder to explain, I had spent 9 years watching that company. I knew its people. I knew what it was capable of when it was managed well. Letting it collapse because I was angry at its CEO seemed like a waste of something real. Claire was quiet for a moment, her pen still. "Most people," she said, "would have let it collapse." "I know," Emily said. "Most people would have. That's a legitimate choice. It just wasn't mine." The interview lasted 3 hours. It was the longest Emily had spoken about herself in a single sitting in her adult life, and it was strange in the way that all genuinely unfamiliar things are strange, not uncomfortable exactly, but requiring a specific kind of attention she was not accustomed to paying. She was used to being the person who asked questions, who gathered information, who processed and analyzed and decided. Being the subject of that process felt like standing on the other side of a mirror she had always looked into from one direction. Claire was skilled. She moved between the professional and the personal with a precision that told Emily she had mapped the whole territory before arriving and was now navigating it with purpose. She asked about Everstone's founding, about the early investment philosophy, about the specific companies that had defined the portfolio. She asked about the market analysis Emily had developed during the marriage that had quietly informed several of Nathan's most successful projects. She asked about the rescue investment in detail, the mechanics, the timeline, the decision process. And then about 90 minutes in, she asked the question that changed the texture of the conversation entirely. "The women who will read this story," Claire said, "the ones who are 55, 60 years old, who spent decades in the background of someone else's success, who gave their best years to a partnership that didn't see them clearly." She put her pen down. "What do you want them to know?" Emily was quiet for a long moment. Outside the office, she could hear Marcus on the phone, the low hum of the building, the distant sound of the city, doing its ordinary work. All of it felt very far away. "I want them to know," she said slowly, "that invisible is not the same as powerless. Those two things can feel identical from the inside, but they are not the same." She looked at Claire directly. "I was invisible to Nathan for years. He looked at me every day and saw what he expected to see, which was nothing particularly important. But I was building the whole time. Every single day I was building." She paused. "The building doesn't stop just because no one is watching." Claire wrote something, a long something. "And the women who didn't build something," Claire said, "who gave those years and don't have an Everstone waiting in the background, what do you want them to know?" It was a harder question. Emily respected her for asking it. "That what they built may not have a name or a valuation," she said, "but it is still real. Children communities' knowledge, care, these things have value that doesn't show up in a financial filing. The fact that our systems don't know how to measure something doesn't mean it has no worth." She paused. "And it is never too late to start something that does have a name. Never. I have met women who started their first company at 63, at 67. The market does not care how old you are. It cares whether your idea is sound." Claire looked at her. "Do you believe that, or is that what you say?" Emily met her eyes. "I believe it because I have seen it, twice in my own portfolio. Both of them are profitable now." Claire closed her notebook. "Off the record," she said, "just between us." Emily waited. "Are you okay?" Claire asked. Not as a journalist, as a person. After all of it, the divorce, the hearings, everything that got said in that courtroom. Are you actually okay? Emily thought about the honest answer. Not the professional answer, not the composed answer, but the actual true one that lived underneath all of the composure and competence and forward motion. "I am," she said. "I was not for a while. There was a period about 18 months ago before I made the decision to file when I was not okay at all. When it was very hard to sit in my own life and feel good about any of it." She was careful and precise about this, the way she was careful and precise about everything. "I had built something extraordinary, and I was sitting in a marriage where the person closest to me had decided I was worth nothing. And for a while, not a long while, but a while, I let that assessment touch me. I let it get close enough to do some damage." Claire was very still. "And then," Emily said, "I did what I always do when something isn't working. I looked at the data. I looked at the actual facts of my actual life separate from what anyone else was telling me about it. And the facts were very clear." She almost smiled. "The facts were, in fact, spectacular." Claire laughed, a real one, surprised out of her. "The facts were spectacular," she repeated. "The facts were spectacular," Emily confirmed. "And once I could see them clearly again, I was fine." The interview ran in the magazine 12 days later. The cover line read, "The Woman Who Built $1 Billion in Silence." Emily's photograph, the one Claire's photographer had taken in the 43rd floor office, Emily standing at her desk in a simple gray blazer, looking directly into the camera, with the steady, unhurried attention she gave to everything, ran full page beside the headline. By the morning of publication day, the piece had been shared 40,000 times online. By afternoon, it was 112,000. By the following morning, Emily Carter was no longer a name that required explanation. She was in her office at 7:15 when Marcus appeared in the doorway and said simply, "It's everywhere." "I know," she said. She had been watching the numbers since 5. "Interview requests," he said. 19 so far this morning, 3 television, the rest print or digital. "Hold all of them," she said. "I'll review the list on Friday and decide which ones serve a purpose." He wrote it down, and Nathan called. She looked up. "He called the main line," Marcus said. "Not Daniel, not through Gerald. He called the main line and asked to speak to you directly. He left a number." She was quiet for a moment. "When 6:47 this morning." Before the magazine hit most people's inboxes, which meant he had seen it early, perhaps a press preview, or perhaps someone on his team had flagged it the night before. "I'll call him back," she said. "This afternoon." She did not call him back that afternoon because the afternoon was consumed by something she had not anticipated, a call from her lead attorney in Singapore about a portfolio company that needed an urgent decision, followed by a 3-way conference with her London team and a fund manager in Zurich who had been on the fence about a co-investment for 6 weeks and had apparently been moved off that fence by reading the magazine piece. The Zurich call alone ran 90 minutes and ended with a term sheet agreement that represented the largest single co-investment Everstone had secured in 4 years. Marcus, when she told him, said, "The article did that." "The work did that," Emily said. "The article just told people the work existed." She called Nathan at 6:40 in the evening from the back of the car on the way home. She almost did not. It had been a long day, and she was tired in the specific way that comes from a day of sustained concentration, the kind of tired that lives behind your eyes and in the back of your shoulders. But she had said she would, and Emily Carter did what she said she would do. He answered on the second ring. "I saw the piece," he said. No preamble, no greeting, just that, which was very Nathan. She thought he had always moved directly to the thing he most wanted to say. "I know," she said. "The photograph." A pause. You look like yourself. The way you used to look before everything got—" He stopped. "You look good." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. "I wanted to tell you," he said, "that I've been thinking about what you said, in the conference room, about the employees." Another pause. "I went to the Nevada job site last week, just walked through it, talked to some of the crew." This surprised her. She had not expected it, and she had expected quite a few things from Nathan in the past 3 weeks. "How was it?" "Hard," he said, and the word was simple and unperformed and completely honest. "To see them and know that I almost—" He stopped. "There's a guy named Hector who's been on that crew for 6 years. He's got 3 kids. He told me his oldest just got into college." A longer pause. "I almost took that from him. Not because of them, because of me, because of my ego and my bad judgment and my—" He did not finish. Emily looked out the window at the evening traffic. She thought about Hector and his 3 kids and his oldest in college, and she thought about the 6 months she had spent deciding whether to make the investment, and she thought about the reason she had finally decided to move. "Nathan," she said. "Yeah, you didn't take it from him. You made decisions that put it at risk, and then you, with some help, made sure it survived." She paused. "That's the whole story, not just the part where you made the mistakes." Silence on the other end. "I don't deserve that," he said. "It's not about what you deserve," she said. "It's about what's true." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "Emily, I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly." "I'll try," she said. "Did you ever love me after you figured out what I was? After you saw who I was becoming? Did you still love me, or were you just protecting the company, protecting the investment?" It was, she thought, the most honest question he had ever asked her. In 11 years of marriage, through the early years of real partnership, and the middle years of gradual distance, and the final years of quiet devastation, he had never once asked her something this undefended. She gave it the honest answer it deserved. "I loved you for a very long time after I saw who you were becoming," she said. "That is not a comfortable thing to admit, but it is true. I loved you, and I watched you change, and I kept loving you anyway, because that is what love does. It stays longer than it probably should." She paused. "The investment and the love were not separate decisions. I made them both for the same reason. Because I had not yet stopped caring what happened to you. A breath. And then at some point I did stop. Not all at once. Gradually, the way these things always go. And after that, the investment was just business. Another silence. Okay, Nathan said, very quietly. Okay, she agreed. For what it's worth, he said, I never stopped. She had not expected that either. She sat with it for a moment, the weight of it, the complicated truth of a man who had treated her terribly and apparently loved her simultaneously, because those two things were not mutually exclusive, she had learned. People did it all the time. They loved you and diminished you and meant both completely. I know, she said. And that's, she thought about the right word, that's its own kind of sad, Nathan. He made a sound that might have been agreement, or might have been something that had no name. Take care of the company, she said. Take care of Hector. I will, he said. She ended the call. The car moved through the Los Angeles evening. She looked at her phone for a moment, then put it in her bag and looked out the window instead. She did not feel sad exactly. She felt the particular weight of a story that had reached its true ending, not the dramatic ending of the courtroom, which had felt enormous, but this quieter ending in the back of a car in evening traffic where two people had finally said true things to each other, and both of them knew that what came next would be different from everything that had come before. 3 weeks after the magazine piece ran, the COO search committee met for the first time. Emily's designated representative was a woman named Anita Patel, 47, former operations chief at a mid-sized development firm in the Bay Area. Someone Emily had known professionally for 8 years and trusted completely. Anita joined the committee with the same thorough preparation Emily expected from everyone she worked with closely, and within 20 minutes of the first meeting, Robert Ellison had called Emily's direct line. "Where did you find her?" he said. "She found me," Emily said. 8 years ago. I was smarter than the last person she worked for, and I hired her." "Can I steal her?" "No," Emily said. "But you can work with her, which is better." The COO process took 6 weeks. It was by Emily's standards fast. She had run slower searches for positions with less at stake. But the Whitmore board was motivated by recent events to move with more urgency than boards typically manage, and Nathan, whatever his other qualities, had the ability when properly focused to make decisions quickly and stick to them. The person they selected was a woman named Diane Park, 53 years old, second-generation Korean-American, 26 years in commercial real estate development with a reputation for taking distressed operations and making them functional within 18 months. She was not a name that appeared in many profiles or on many panels. She was, as Robert Ellison put it at the final selection meeting, simply the best person for the job. Nathan at that same meeting had said, "She reminds me of someone." Ellison had looked at him. Who? Nathan had looked at his hands. "Someone I underestimated," he said, "for a long time." Nobody said anything, but the room understood. Diane Park started on a Monday morning in November. Emily was not there for her first day. She had meetings in London. But Marcus sent her a message at 2 in the afternoon Los Angeles time, which was 10 at night for Emily sitting in a hotel room in Mayfair. And the message said, Diane Park walked into the Whitmore executive meeting at 9 this morning, and the first thing she said was, "I understand there's a Nevada situation. Let's start there." Emily read the message twice. Then she typed back, "Good." She put her phone down and looked at the ceiling of the hotel room and felt something she recognized after a moment as satisfaction. Not the sharp satisfaction of a win, but the slower, quieter satisfaction of a thing going the way it should go, the way you spent years trying to make it go, the satisfaction of design working as intended. She had been in London for a portfolio review, but the real reason she had scheduled the trip this particular week was a meeting on Wednesday morning with a woman named Helen Marsh, who ran a nonprofit focused on financial literacy for women over 50. Emily had been aware of Helen's work for 2 years, had tracked the organization's outcomes data, and had been looking for the right moment to have the right conversation. The right moment, she had decided, was now. They met at a small restaurant in Mayfair on Wednesday at 8 in the morning. Helen was 63, English, with the brisk, purposeful energy of someone who had spent decades converting concern into action and had no patience for the gap between the two. She shook Emily's hand, sat down, and said, "I read the article 3 times. "What did you think?" Emily asked. "I thought," Helen said, "that you are exactly the kind of person we have been trying to find for 7 years, and I cannot quite believe you called me." I called you, Emily said, because your outcomes data is exceptional, and because the women your organization serves are the women I care most about reaching, and because I have recently come into a situation where I have a great deal of visibility I did not previously have, and I would like to use it for something that matters. She picked up her coffee. So, tell me what you need, Helen told her. It took 40 minutes, and by the end of it, Emily had made 3 decisions, 2 of which she communicated to Helen directly, and 1 of which she held back to confirm with her team. The first was a founding gift to the organization's new digital literacy program, significant enough to fund 3 years of operations. The second was a commitment to serve as a public advocate, which meant speaking at events and lending her name and her story to the organization's fundraising efforts in a way she would not have been willing to do 3 months ago before the magazine piece had made her story public property. The third decision, the one she held back, was about something larger, something she had been turning over in her mind since Claire Donovan had asked her what she wanted the older women to know. Since she had sat in the back of a car and thought about invisible not being the same as powerless. Since she had built Everstone in 19 years of quiet and was now for the first time wondering what she might build if she did it loudly. She returned to Los Angeles on Thursday evening. Marcus picked her up from the airport, which he did not typically do, and the fact that he was there in person, rather than sending a car, told her something had happened. "What is it?" she said as soon as she was in the car. He handed her his phone. On the screen was a news alert, not from a financial publication this time, from a general news site. The headline read, "Victoria Blake speaks out on Whitmore divorce, claims she was also deceived." Emily read the first 3 paragraphs. Victoria had given an interview not to Claire Donovan, not to any of the financial press that had covered the divorce proceedings, but to a celebrity-adjacent publication that specialized in the personal lives of wealthy Los Angeles socialites. In the interview, Victoria claimed that Nathan had misrepresented his financial situation to her as well, that she had believed she was entering a relationship with a man of certain means, and that she had been, in her word, blindsided by the revelations in the courtroom. Emily handed the phone back to Marcus. "What do you want to do about it?" he asked. "Nothing," she said. He glanced at her. "The journalist who wrote it is going to call for a comment." "Tell them no comment." "And if they reach out to Claire?" "Claire will make her own decision," Emily said. "She doesn't need my direction." She looked out the window at the freeway. She thought about Victoria, whom she had never hated, because hate required a kind of sustained energy she had always considered wasteful, but whom she had never quite been able to see clearly, because Victoria had always existed in her mind as a symbol of something rather than as a person. Now reading those 3 paragraphs, she saw Victoria more clearly than she had before, a woman who had built her life on proximity to wealth and who had found in the courtroom on that first morning that the proximity she thought she had secured was standing on ground considerably less solid than advertised. A woman now trying to exit a narrative that had turned unfavorable by repositioning herself as another victim of Nathan's deception. It was not a dignified exit, but it was a human one. Emily thought with something close to compassion that Victoria Blake was also a woman who had spent years making herself useful to the wrong people and was now discovering the cost of that strategy. The cost was different from Emily's cost. The lessons were different. But the underlying experience of being seen only in relation to someone else, of having your value determined by whose orbit you occupied, was not entirely unlike her own. She said none of this to Marcus. She said, "Take me home." Home was still the small rented apartment. She had not moved, had not upgraded, had not done any of the things that people expected a woman of her means to do when her story became public, and her face appeared on the cover of a national magazine. The apartment was near her office, had good light in the morning, and was quiet enough that she could think clearly at night. Those were the criteria she had always used, and she saw no reason to change them now. She made herself tea, sat at the small table near the window, and opened her laptop. She had an email from Claire Donovan sent 3 hours ago. The subject line was "Follow-up question when you're ready." She opened it. Claire had written, "I've been thinking about something you said in the interview that didn't make the final piece because we ran out of space. You said, and I kept the recording, you said that the silence was also protection, that you were protecting the work. And I've been wondering now that the work doesn't need that protection anymore. Who are you without the silence? Not what will you do. Who are you?" Emily read it twice. Then she closed the laptop without responding. She sat with the question for a long time. The apartment was quiet. Outside Los Angeles was doing what Los Angeles always did at this hour, moving, generating, producing light and noise, and the constant low-grade energy of a city that had decided long ago that stopping was not an option. Who was she without the silence? It was, she thought, a question that deserved more than an email response. It deserved time. It deserved the kind of honest excavation she gave to every problem that actually mattered. The deliberate, unhurried attention of a person who understood that the most important questions were rarely the ones that yielded quickly. She had spent 19 years building Everstone in silence. She had spent 11 years building a marriage that could not hold what she was. She had spent the last 3 weeks doing something she had never done before, standing in the light, being seen, allowing the story that she had always known about herself to be known by others. And she was discovering in those 3 weeks that visibility felt different than she had imagined. Not worse, not better exactly, just different. Like switching from one language to another, the thoughts were the same, but the way they moved through the air had changed, and that change required its own adjustment, its own learning, its own patience. She was not afraid of learning new things. She had never been afraid of that. She opened her laptop again. She typed back to Claire. "That is a very good question. I'll need some time to answer it properly. Can we talk in a few weeks?" Claire responded in 11 minutes. "Absolutely. Take all the time you need. For what it's worth, from the outside, it looks like you know exactly who you are." Emily read that and set her laptop aside and looked out the window. Below, the city moved and turned and lit itself against the dark. She thought about Hector, who had 3 kids and a college-bound oldest working a job site in Nevada that was going to be fine. She thought about Helen Marsh in London, who had spent 23 years trying to give women the tools to build their own version of solid ground. She thought about Diane Park walking into the Whitmore executive meeting on a Monday morning and saying, "Let's start with the problem." She thought about the legal pad on the conference room table and the 4 words in Nathan's cramped handwriting and the complicated truth that people could be wrong about you for years and still in the end arrive at something close to honest. She thought about the 19 years of silence, and she thought quietly to herself in the apartment near the office with the good morning light that the silence had done its job. It had protected the work while the work needed protecting. And the work was solid now. The work was visible. The work was standing on its own in its own light, requiring nothing from her but the continued attention and intelligence and care that she had always been entirely willing to give. The silence had been necessary. And now something else was necessary. She was not yet entirely sure what that something was. But Emily Carter had spent her entire adult life moving deliberately toward things she was not yet entirely sure of, and she had learned through 19 years and $60 million and 11 years of marriage and one very loud morning in courtroom 7 that the not yet sure part was not a problem to be solved. It was the most interesting part of the whole story. She closed her laptop, finished her tea, and went to bed. Tomorrow there was work to do. There was always work to do. And she had never, not once in her life, been anything other than ready for it. The call came on a Wednesday morning, 6 weeks after the magazine piece ran, while Emily was in the middle of reviewing a term sheet for a renewable energy startup based out of Austin, Texas. Marcus appeared in the doorway, not his usual knock and enter, but the version where he stood at the threshold and waited, which told her the interruption was significant. She looked up. "Helen Marsh," he said, "from London. She says it's important." Emily set the term sheet down and picked up the phone. Helen's voice when it came through was different from the brisk, purposeful tone of the Mayfair breakfast. There was something underneath it, a controlled excitement, the sound of a person who had been sitting on news long enough that containing it had become genuinely difficult. "I need to tell you something," Helen said, "before it comes out publicly, because it involves you and you deserve to hear it from me first." Emily said, "Go ahead." "The gift you made to our digital literacy program," Helen said. "We announced it internally 3 days ago, to our staff, our board, our existing donors. We had not planned to go public until next month." A pause. "Someone leaked it." Emily was very still. "Who?" "We don't know yet, but the story is running in 2 hours. A financial publication. They have the full amount, the program details, and—" Helen stopped. "Emily, they also have your statement. The one you gave me about why you made the gift. The personal one about the women you wanted to reach." Emily closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds. She had given Helen that statement privately over email as context, as the kind of honest background explanation she gave when she trusted the person she was speaking to. It was not for publication. It was not polished or considered for public consumption. It was simply true, which was, she recognized now, precisely what made it dangerous in the wrong hands. "What does the statement say?" she asked. She knew what it said. She needed to hear how Helen described it. "You wrote," Helen said carefully, "that you wanted to reach women who had spent decades being told their value was determined by the men beside them, and that you were one of those women once briefly before you remembered who you were." Helen paused. "And you wrote that you were making the gift because silence had protected you, and now you wanted your voice to protect someone else." The line was quiet. "Emily," Helen said, "I am so sorry. I have no idea how this happened. If it was someone on my staff—" "It's all right," Emily said. "It's not all right. That was private communication and—" "Helen," Emily's voice was steady, "is the statement accurate?" A pause. "Yes, word for word." "Then let it run," Emily said. Silence on the other end. "Are you sure?" Helen asked. Emily thought about it for exactly the length of time it deserved, which was not very long. The statement was true. It said nothing she was ashamed of. It said nothing she would not, if pressed, have said publicly on her own terms. It simply said it in a rawer form than she would have chosen without the careful architecture she typically brought to her public communications. But rawer, she thought, was not necessarily worse. Rawer was, in fact, sometimes better. "Let it run," she said again. "And Helen, when they call you for comment, tell them the gift stands and the program launches on schedule. Nothing else. Let the statement speak for itself." She ended the call and looked at Marcus, who had remained in the doorway through the entire conversation with the focused patience of someone who understood when to stay and when to leave. "The Austin term sheet," she said. "I need another hour with it. Hold everything else." He nodded and left. She picked up the term sheet. She read it for exactly 11 minutes before she put it down again, because her mind had gone somewhere else entirely. Not to the leaked statement, not to the publication that was running it, but to the sentence Helen had read back to her. The one about silence having protected her, and wanting her voice to protect someone else. She had written that at 11:30 on a Tuesday night in her apartment in a single sitting without revision, the way she wrote everything that she wrote only for herself. She had not expected anyone to read it. She had not written it for anyone to read. But now someone was going to read it. Many people in 2 hours. And she sat with that knowledge for a moment, sat with the exposure of it, the specific vulnerability of words written in private appearing in public, and she waited to feel afraid. She did not feel afraid. She felt something else, something that took her a moment to identify because it was unfamiliar enough that she did not have it immediately cataloged. She felt free. The story ran at 11:15. By noon it had more engagement than the original magazine piece. By 1 o'clock, Marcus had fielded 14 calls, including 2 from major television networks, 1 from a senator's office, whose constituent programs focused on women's economic empowerment, and 1 from a woman named Gloria Chen, who introduced herself as the founder of a financial literacy nonprofit in Chicago, and said very simply, "I've been doing this work for 15 years, and I have never been so glad to see someone with resources decide to use them correctly. How do we connect?" Emily took that call personally. Gloria Chen was 67, had started her organization after a divorce at 52, had left her financially devastated despite decades of work, and had built it into a program that served 3,000 women annually with a staff of 12 and a budget that was, Emily could see from the publicly available filings, perpetually insufficient for what it was trying to accomplish. They talked for 45 minutes. By the end, Emily had agreed to a site visit in Chicago in 3 weeks and had asked Marcus to prepare a background brief on the organization's financials. She had also, somewhere in the middle of that conversation, made a decision that had been forming in the back of her mind since the Mayfair breakfast with Helen, since Claire's question about who she was without the silence since the elevator ride on the 43rd floor, the night she realized the work was solid enough to stand in its own light. She had decided what came next. Not an expansion of Everstone. The company was performing well and did not need disruption for the sake of it. Not a public role in the traditional sense board positions, advisory councils, the circuit of conferences and panels where prominent business figures performed their visibility for each other. Something different. something that used the specific combination of things. She was the financial expertise, the analytical precision, the story that had now become, whether she had planned it or not, something that resonated with women who recognized in it the contours of their own experience to do work that the market alone would never fund, because the market did not know how to measure its return. She was going to build a foundation, not quietly, not in the background, not in the 19-year silence that had been necessary then and was not necessary now. She was going to build it in full view of everyone, with her name on the door and her voice in the room, and she was going to use every lesson she had ever learned about building things that lasted, about fundamentals and patience, and the discipline to care more about getting it right than about being seen getting it right to make it exceptional. She called Daniel at 2:15. "I need you to start the legal structure for a foundation," she said. "Everstone Foundation. I want it independent of the main company. Separate governance, separate board, its own identity." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "How large are we talking?" "Initial endowment of $50 million," she said, "with a commitment to grow it over 5 years." A longer silence. "Emily." "I know," she said. "I know what it is, Daniel. Will you start the structure?" "Of course," he said. "Of course I will." A pause. "Can I ask what changed?" She thought about the honest answer, about Claire's question, about the leaked statement and the feeling of freedom that had come with it, about Gloria Chen and 15 years of work and a budget that was perpetually insufficient, about Hector in Nevada and Helen in London and the board members' 4 words on a legal pad and Nathan's quiet voice saying, "You were always right." "Nothing changed," she said. "I just finally stopped waiting for the right moment and recognized that I was already standing in it." She heard Daniel smile through the phone. "I'll have the preliminary structure to you by Friday," he said. 3 weeks later, Emily flew to Chicago. Gloria Chen met her at the door of a building on the South Side that housed 6 nonprofit organizations, including Gloria's, all of them sharing space with the particular creative friction of people who were trying to accomplish too much with too little, and had decided that proximity to others in the same situation was preferable to isolation. Gloria was exactly what she had seemed on the phone: direct, intelligent, deeply informed about the populations she served, and carrying the specific tiredness of someone who had been running at full capacity for 15 years without adequate resources. She was also, Emily recognized within the first 20 minutes, one of the most gifted educators she had ever encountered. The way Gloria explained financial concepts to the women in her program, without condescension, without jargon, with the patient, precision of someone who understood that knowledge was not the issue, that what stood between most of her clients and financial stability was not intelligence, but access and confidence, was extraordinary. Emily sat in on 2 sessions. In the first session, 11 women sat in folding chairs in a room that needed a new heating system, and Gloria walked them through the mechanics of a credit report with the calm, clear energy of someone for whom this material was neither boring nor overwhelming, but simply important, worthy of full attention, worthy of real understanding. In the second session, 4 women who had been through Gloria's full program sat around a table and talked about what they were building: a catering business, a childcare cooperative, a small accounting practice, an online resale operation that had grown in 8 months from a side project into something that was paying her rent. Emily sat and listened and did not speak, because this was not her room and not her moment, and she understood the difference between those times. After the sessions, Gloria walked her to a small office and closed the door. "What did you think?" Gloria asked. "I think," Emily said, "that you have built something extraordinary with almost nothing, and I would like to know what you could build with something." Gloria looked at her steadily. "Define something," Emily told her. Gloria was quiet for a long moment. Her hands were folded on the desk in front of her, and Emily watched her process the number, not with the theatrical shock that some people performed when confronted with significant figures, but with the focused attention of a person doing real arithmetic about real impact. "That would fund us for—" Gloria stopped, recalculated. 10 years, at full capacity." "Yes," Emily said. "And you would want—" "Nothing," Emily said. "Everstone Foundation will have a seat on your advisory board, which means I would like to know how the money is being used and whether the outcomes data continues to support the model. That is all. You run the program. You make the decisions." She paused. I am not interested in controlling what you have built. I am interested in making sure it doesn't disappear because a grant cycle ended. Gloria looked at her for a long time. Then she said, "Why Chicago, why us? There are better-known organizations, better-connected ones." "Because the outcomes data is real," Emily said. "I have read your annual reports for 3 years. The women who go through your program, their financial stability metrics, their business survival rates, their credit improvement trajectories, they are better than organizations with 5 times your budget." She held Gloria's gaze. "I do not give money to names. I give money to results." Gloria's jaw worked slightly. She looked away for a moment toward the window, and Emily recognized the expression, the specific combination of relief and disbelief, and the precarious dignity of a person who has spent years working hard for something real and has not always been certain that anyone would notice. "Okay," Gloria said. Her voice was slightly unsteady, which she did not try to hide. "Okay, yes." Emily extended her hand. Gloria shook it. And that was how the first grant from Everstone Foundation was made, not in a formal ceremony, not with photographers or press releases, or the careful choreography of institutional philanthropy, but in a small office in Chicago, with a handshake between 2 women who understood what it meant to build something that mattered, and had decided together that it was time for the building to continue. The foundation's public launch happened on a Thursday morning in January in a room that Marcus had organized with the precise efficiency that characterized everything he did. Emily had agreed to 1 camera, 1 journalist, Claire Donovan, because trust was not infinitely transferable, and Claire had earned hers and a simple statement. She stood at the podium and looked at the room. There were 43 people present. Foundation staff, legal representatives, 3 nonprofit partners, including Gloria, who had flown in from Chicago and was sitting in the front row with the same focused attention she brought to everything. Robert Ellison from the Whitmore board, who had asked to attend, and whom Emily had invited because she had come to think of him as someone worth having in important rooms. Daniel Reynolds, who had built the legal structure in 12 days flat. Marcus standing near the back with his notepad looking like a person who was very proud of himself and trying not to show it. And in the second row, unexpected and unannounced Nathan. She had not invited him. She had not told him about the launch. But he was there in the second row in a dark jacket with no tie, sitting with his hands in his lap and his face carrying the expression she had come to associate with the newer version of him, the one that had emerged slowly and imperfectly from the wreckage of the courtroom and the board meeting and the phone call about Hector. She held his gaze for a moment. He nodded very slightly. She looked back at the room. She spoke for 12 minutes. She talked about Everstone Foundation, its mission, its initial partners, its focus on women over 50 who were rebuilding financial lives after divorce job loss, or the kind of long-term economic invisibility that came from decades of unpaid or undervalued work. She talked about Gloria's program in Chicago and Helen's program in London, and 2 additional organizations she had identified in Atlanta and Phoenix that would receive funding in the foundation's first year. And then she said the thing she had been working toward, the thing that had been forming since the Mayfair breakfast and the leaked statement and the feeling of freedom and Claire's question about who she was without the silence. "I spent 19 years building something extraordinary in complete silence," she said. "I chose that silence deliberately, and I do not regret it because the silence was part of how the work got done. But I am aware that not everyone has 19 years and the specific resources I had to protect themselves while they built." She paused. "There are women in this country, millions of them, who are standing exactly where I stood at the beginning, with capability, with intelligence, with the ability to build real things. And what stands between them and that building is not a lack of talent. It is a lack of access, a lack of capital, and the specific devastating experience of having spent so long being told they have no value that they have begun on some level to believe it." She looked at the room. "Everstone Foundation exists because I know what that experience costs. I know it in my own history. And I know that the moment someone stops believing it, the moment someone shows up and says, actually, you have been wrong about yourself, and here is the proof, everything becomes possible." The room was very quiet. "This foundation is not charity," she said. "Charity suggests that the people receiving it are in need of rescue. That is not what this is. This is investment. In women who have already proven repeatedly that they know how to do more with less than anyone has a right to ask. We are simply going to stop asking them to do it alone." She stepped back from the podium. The room applauded real applause, the kind that comes from people who have been moved, rather than people who are performing, being moved, and Emily stood and received it with the same steady calm she brought to everything, because she had learned long ago that the appropriate response to recognition was not deflection and not performance, but simply presence. Afterward, as the room began to move and conversation started, and Marcus efficiently managed the logistics of a dozen simultaneous interactions, Nathan appeared at her side. She looked at him. He looked back. "How did you know about this?" she asked. "Robert Ellison told me," he said. "Last week. He asked if I was going to come, and I said I didn't know if I should." A pause. "He told me I should." She thought about Robert Ellison, who had said very little in their months of working together and had consistently managed to be right with everything he said. "He was correct," she said. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Around them the room moved and talked, but the small space they occupied was its own separate thing. "That speech," he said, "the part about someone showing up and saying you've been wrong about yourself." He stopped. "I was the one who told you that, for years. I was the one who—" "Nathan." She stopped him gently. "I know. I just need you to know that I know," he said. "That's all. I'm not asking for anything. I just need you to know that I understand what I did and that it was—" He shook his head. "It was the worst mistake of my life. Not the business decisions, not the asset transfers. This, what I said to you and about you and the way I made you feel for years." He looked at her directly. "That was the worst thing I ever did." She had not expected him to say it with quite that much clarity. Not the managed version of accountability he had displayed in the courtroom, or the careful version from the conference room, or the quieter version from the phone call about Hector. This was something else. This was a man who had spent months sitting with the full weight of something and had finally arrived at the place where he could hold it without flinching. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know, and I need you to understand something in return." He waited. "What you did damaged me," she said. "I want to be honest about that, because minimizing it would not be fair to either of us. There were years when your assessment of me got inside and did damage that took a long time to repair, and I repaired it. I am fully repaired." She held his gaze. "But the repair required work that should not have been necessary. That work was real, and it cost me something, and I need you to hold that honestly." "I will," he said. "I do." She nodded. "The company is doing better," he said after a moment, because Nathan, when he did not know what else to say, always returned to the work. She had always known that about him. "Diane Park she's extraordinary. The Nevada situation is on track to resolve by April. The board it's different now. The way we talk about things is different." "Good," Emily said. "It's because of you," he said. "The structure you put in place, the accountability you insisted on." He paused. "I fought it. At the time, I fought everything you proposed because my ego couldn't—" He stopped. "But it's working. The company is actually healthier than it's been in 5 years." "Good," she said again, and she meant it clearly, completely, without residue. The company's health was not Nathan's redemption, and it was not her vindication, and it was not a conclusion to anything. It was simply good. 412 people going to work. Hector's oldest in college. A company that had almost collapsed and had not. Good. Emily. He said her name the way he had said it in the early years, without the weight of resentment or the distance of contempt, just her name clean and direct. "I hope you know that what you built Everstone, this foundation, all of it, it's the most impressive thing I have ever witnessed up close, and I was standing next to it for 11 years without seeing it." His voice was low. "That's a failure of attention I will carry for the rest of my life." She looked at him. For a long moment she did not say anything. Not because she did not have anything to say, but because she was deciding whether this was a moment that required words or whether it was a moment that was already complete. She decided it was complete. "Take care of yourself, Nathan," she said. "Take care of the company. Take care of the people in it." He nodded. "I will." He started to move away, then turned back. "The foundation is going to change a lot of lives," he said. "I genuinely believe that." "So do I," she said. "That's why I built it." He left. She stood for a moment in the space he had vacated in the middle of the room she had filled on the morning of the thing she had decided to build next. Around her, Gloria was talking to Claire Donovan with the animated precision of a person explaining something she loved. Robert Ellison was speaking with one of the Foundation's legal representatives with the focused attention he brought to every conversation. Marcus was managing 3 simultaneous logistics with a phone in one hand and his notepad in the other. And somewhere across the city, in an office on the 43rd floor of a building on Wilshire Boulevard, Everstone Capital Partners was running managing portfolios, analyzing markets, making the careful evidence-based decisions that had grown a family inheritance into one of the most quietly powerful investment operations in the country. Running without Emily in the room, because she had built it to run without her in the room, because the mark of a well-built thing was that it could stand on its own. It was standing. Everything she had built was standing. She walked toward Gloria, who looked up from her conversation with Claire and smiled. Not the cautious smile of someone still adjusting to a new reality, but the full, unguarded smile of a person who had received something real and had decided to be glad about it without apology. "Come meet someone," Gloria said, reaching out and pulling Emily into the conversation with the ease of a woman who had spent 30 years building connections between people who needed to know each other. "Claire was just asking me about the Chicago program outcomes. I told her she should hear it from you." Emily looked at Claire, who had her recorder out and her pen ready, and the specific alert attention of a journalist who understood she was in the middle of a story that was still unfolding. "From the beginning?" Emily asked. Claire said, "From wherever you want to start." Emily thought about where to start. She thought about the beginning, the small investment portfolio, the early decisions, the 19 years of building. She thought about the middle, the marriage, the slow erosion, the rescue investment made in secret for the people on a job site who deserved better than to lose everything because of decisions made above them. She thought about the end, the courtroom, the revelation, the quiet Friday that changed the shape of everything. And she thought about now. The Foundation, the Chicago office, the 43 people in this room, the women in Helen's program in London and Gloria's program in Chicago, and the organizations in Atlanta and Phoenix that would receive their first funding by March. She thought about all the women who would never make the magazine cover, who would never have a courtroom revelation or a conference room reckoning, who would simply one day, with the right access and the right information, and someone finally saying, "You are not wrong about yourself," begin to build something that was entirely their own. That was where the real story was. That was where it had always been. "I'll start," Emily said, with a woman who spent 19 years building something real while everyone around her looked the other way. She began to talk. And in that room on a Thursday morning in January, with the city moving below them and the work continuing in all directions, and the future arriving. The way futures always do, not with a signal or a ceremony, but simply as the next thing that needed to be done, Emily Carter finally told her own story in her own voice in full for the very first time. Not because she needed to be heard, but because somewhere out there was a woman sitting in silence, building something real, and she needed to know that the building was worth it, that the silence could end, that the moment always came, and that when it did you would be ready because you had been preparing for it your entire life, in every quiet room, in every careful decision, in every year of doing the work, without waiting for anyone's permission or recognition or belief. You would be ready. Because you had never, not for a single day, stopped being exactly who you were, and who you were had always